Her grandfather left her an island no one would enter, until her dog found what he was hiding. When Clara Whitmore stepped onto Blackrift Isle, she expected nothing but wind, rock, and old resentment. The locals called it cursed. Fishermen swore the cliffs sang at night. But her German shepherd, Atlas, didn't sense ghosts. He sensed something beneath the ground. And by the time the storm rolled in, Clara realized the island wasn't haunted at all. It was guarding a secret decades in the making. If you inherited a place everyone feared, would you sell it? Or stay long enough to uncover the truth? The envelope was heavier than it looked. Clara Whitmore stood in the narrow entryway of her Portland townhouse, turning the thick cream paper over in her hands while Atlas waited patiently at her side. The late November wind rattled the storm door behind her, carrying with it the sharp scent of salt from Casco Bay. She had just returned from the marina, where she still volunteered 2 mornings a week, unable to fully detach from the harbor life she'd retired from 3 years earlier. Atlas leaned against her leg, solid and warm. His graying muzzle brushed her coat, as if urging her to move, to do something. He had once been a search and rescue dog for the Coast Guard, steady under pressure, fearless in storms. Now, at 10 years old, he carried his age with quiet dignity. Since her husband Daniel had died 4 winters ago, Atlas had rarely left her side. Clara slit the envelope open with the edge of a kitchen knife. She read the first line once, then again. Her grandfather, Elias Whitmore, had died in late September, so she had not spoken his name aloud in more than 20 years. The letter came from a legal office in Rockland. The language was formal, precise. She was the sole beneficiary of a property identified as Blackrift Isle, an island parcel located roughly 9 nautical miles off the Atlantic coast, near a place called Barrows Point. Clara lowered the paper slowly to the kitchen counter. Blackrift Isle. She could almost hear her father's voice saying it, tight with anger. The island had been the breaking point in their family. She remembered slammed doors, arguments that went on past midnight, her mother crying softly in the next room. She remembered her father calling Elias stubborn, delusional, obsessed with a rock in the middle of nowhere while the family shipyard in Portland collapsed under debt. But Clara had grown up believing her grandfather cared more about that island than about his own son, and now he had left it to her. Atlas shifted, his ears flicking toward her, as if he sensed the change in her breathing. Clara reached down automatically, running her fingers through the thick fur behind his neck. It steadied her. The letter continued. The island had not been occupied for years. Taxes had been maintained through a trust. An inspection would be required before any transfer or sale could be finalized. Sale. That was the only word that mattered. Clara folded the letter carefully. "We're not keeping it," she said aloud, her voice firm in the quiet kitchen. Atlas thumped his tail once against the cabinet. She moved to the window over the sink. Beyond the neighboring rooftops, she could see a thin line of ocean under a gray sky. Portland in late fall felt stripped down to its bones. Fishing boats docked early, tourists gone, gulls circling lazily over the wharf. An island. She pictured something barren, wind-scoured rock, a leaning shack, nothing more. Her father had refused to speak of Elias after the final argument. Clara had been 17. The details blurred over time, but she remembered enough. Developers had offered to buy Blackrift Isle for what was then considered a fortune. Her father wanted to sell. Elias refused. "They can take everything else," her father had shouted one night, "but he won't let go of that damned island." Clara had chosen her father's side without question. Now both men were gone. She sat down at the kitchen table and unfolded the letter again. There was a second page attached, an addendum noting local history. Blackrift Isle was known in Barrows Point as the island no one would touch. Fishing boats avoided its coves. Lobstermen claimed their compasses spun when they drifted too close. Some said lights flickered along the cliffs at night, though no electricity had been registered on the property for decades. Superstition, she thought. Maine's coastline was full of stories like that. Still, something about the phrasing unsettled her. The island no one would touch. It sounded less like folklore and more like warning. Atlas walked to the door and looked back at her, waiting for their afternoon routine, his walk along the eastern promenade. Clara stood and grabbed her coat. The air outside cut clean and sharp across her cheeks. She let Atlas off leash near the waterfront path, was watching as he trotted ahead with measured confidence. Even in retirement, he moved like a dog with purpose. The bay stretched wide and steel gray before them. Far out, small rocky islands rose like dark teeth from the water. Clara found herself studying them more closely than usual. What would Blackrift Isle look like? Bigger than these? Smaller? Hidden behind some fog line beyond sight? A group of older fishermen stood near the railing, drinking coffee from thermoses. Clara recognized one of them, Hank Donnelly, who had worked the harbor since before she started her engineering apprenticeship. "Morning, Clara," he called. She hesitated, then walked over. "You ever hear of Blackrift Isle?" she asked casually. The men exchanged a look. Hank's jaw tightened slightly. "Out near Barrow's Point?" "That's the one." He took a slow sip of coffee. "Ain't much out there but rock and bad stories." "What kind of stories?" He shrugged, but his eyes stayed fixed on the water. "Lights where there shouldn't be. Metal singing in the wind. Boats drifting closer than they meant to. Elias Whitmore lived out there alone for years. Folks said he was chasing ghosts." Clara felt a flicker of irritation. "Ghosts don't run property taxes." Hank gave a dry laugh. "No, but stubborn men do." She walked away before the conversation could go further. That night, she spread the documents across her dining table. Property maps, survey lines, coordinates. The island was roughly 40 acres, irregular in shape, with a single structure noted at its center, a house. She stared at the tiny black square on the map. Slay at her feet, chin resting on his paws, amber eyes watching her. "I'll go up there," she said finally. "Inspect it, list it, sell it, close it." The words felt practical, clean. Yet as she folded the map, she couldn't shake the feeling that the island had been waiting. Waiting for what? She didn't know. Clara turned off the lights and stood in the darkened room for a moment longer than necessary. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, low and constant. She imagined cliffs catching that same wind, empty and untouched. The island no one would enter. Her grandfather had chosen isolation. She would choose something else. Atlas rose when she did, following her toward the hallway. As she paused at the foot of the stairs, he nudged her hand gently, as if sensing the weight of something she couldn't yet name. "Don't worry," she murmured. "It's just paperwork." But even as she said it, she knew that wasn't entirely true. Somewhere beyond the dark water, Blackrift Isle stood alone under the Atlantic sky. And for reasons she did not understand, it no longer felt like just a piece of land. It felt like unfinished business. Atlas stayed close as she climbed the stairs, his steady presence grounding her against a tension she hadn't invited, but could no longer ignore. The island was hers now, whether she wanted it or not. 3 days later, Clara stood at the edge of a narrow wooden dock in Barrow's Point, staring out at the stretch of Atlantic that separated her from Blackrift Isle. The sky hung low and pale, the kind of washed-out gray that seemed to flatten distance. The wind carried the smell of kelp and cold iron. Atlas stood beside her, his leash looped loosely in her hand. His posture was alert but steady, ears forward, eyes scanning the horizon. Barrow's Point was smaller than she'd expected. A handful of weathered buildings, a general store with peeling white paint, and a marina that looked as though it had survived more winters than it cared to count. The locals had watched her when she arrived that morning, not openly unfriendly, but cautious. Outsiders were rare here in November. The paperwork at the small municipal office had been brief. The clerk, a thin woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, had studied Clara over the rim of her glasses. "You're Elias Whitmore's granddaughter," she had said, not quite a question. "Yes." The woman's expression had shifted, something between recognition and reluctance. You'll need to inspect the property before any transfer can be finalized. Regulations." She slid the form across the counter. "And I'd suggest you don't stay after dark." Clara had signed without comment. Now she stood at the marina, looking at the small skiff she had rented from a man named Owen Mercer. No relation, he'd clarified twice. It was an aging boat, 20 feet at most, with a modest outboard engine and a hull that bore the scars of hard use. "You sure about this?" Owen asked now, hands shoved into his coat pockets. He was broad-shouldered, maybe in his early 40s, with wind-chapped skin and a permanent squint from years on the water. "It's 9 nautical miles," Clara replied evenly. "I've handled worse." He glanced at Atlas. "Dog will be fine? He's been in rougher seas than this." Owen nodded but didn't look convinced. "Blackrift's got a way of making folks nervous. I don't believe in curses." "Neither do I," he said. "But that don't mean I anchor there." Clara untied the skiff with steady hands. Atlas stepped in first, settling near the bow as if he'd done it 100 times. She followed, easing the boat away from the dock. The engine sputtered once, then caught. The shoreline of Barrow's Point receded slowly behind her. The houses shrank into pale shapes against the hills. Ahead, the open water widened, dark and restless. The wind stiffened as she moved farther from land, pressing against her coat and tangling strands of gray hair at her temples. Clara kept her eyes forward. Blackrift Isle appeared gradually, at first only a darker smudge against the horizon. Then the outline sharpened. Jagged cliffs, uneven ridges, a narrow crescent of rocky beach. It looked less like an island, and more like something pushed up from the ocean by force. Atlas shifted his weight. Clara noticed it immediately. His body had gone rigid, ears high, gaze fixed not on the water, but on the tree line that crowned the cliffs. His low growl barely rose above the engine's hum. "It's just land," she said quietly, though she wasn't sure whether she was speaking to him or herself. The sky darkened slightly as a bank of clouds rolled in from the east. The water changed texture, ripples sharpening into small whitecaps. Clara adjusted her course, angling toward what looked like a shallow inlet on the southern side of the island. Halfway across, the engine coughed. Clara frowned and checked the throttle. The sound faltered again, then died completely. The sudden silence felt unnatural. Only the wind remained, pushing against the hull. She tried the ignition. Once, twice. The engine sputtered weakly, then fell quiet. "Come on," she muttered, lifting the casing to inspect the fuel line. Nothing obvious, no loose connection. The tank wasn't empty. Atlas stood now, paws braced wide, eyes never leaving the island. The skiff drifted. Clara grabbed an oar and began to row, slow and controlled. She wasn't panicked, not yet. The current wasn't violent, just steady, nudging them closer to the rocks than she'd intended. The cliffs loomed higher as they approached. Blackrift Isle did not welcome them. The stone face rose sharply from the water, dark and slick with moss. Gulls circled above, their cries thin and distant. Atlas let out a single bark. "Easy," Clara said, though her own pulse had begun to quicken. She aimed for a narrow strip of shore where the rocks gave way to gravel. The oars creaked with each pull. Her shoulders burned slightly, but the rhythm steadied her. She'd rowed in worse conditions during her early years at the harbor. As the skiff scraped against the shoreline, Clara jumped out first, boots splashing into the shallows. She secured the rope to a jagged stone outcrop. Atlas leapt beside her, landing lightly despite his size. He immediately turned toward the interior of the island, body angled forward, scanning. The air felt colder here. Not dramatically so, just enough to make Clara aware of the difference. But the wind seemed to move differently around the cliffs, funneling through unseen gaps. The smell of salt was stronger, tinged with something metallic. She looked back at the water. The mainland was barely visible now, a faint blur through haze. Barrow's Point had disappeared entirely. The isolation settled in. Clara adjusted her coat and reached for Atlas's leash, though she didn't clip it on. He stayed close, but his focus was fixed ahead. The island's terrain was uneven. Patches of scrub grass, twisted pines clinging to rock, scattered driftwood bleached pale by sun and salt. No visible path led inward. She took a few careful steps. Behind her, the skiff rocked gently, tethered but vulnerable. She made a mental note to check the engine once she secured shelter. The mechanical failure bothered her. It had been too sudden. Atlas moved ahead a few yards, then stopped abruptly. His entire body stiffened. He was staring into the tree line. Clara followed his gaze. The trees stood still, branches tangled and dark. No movement. No obvious disturbance. Yet Atlas did not relax. "Probably a rabbit," she said, though she didn't quite believe it. She listened. At first there was nothing but wind. Then, very faintly, a sound that didn't belong to the natural rhythm of the island. A distant metallic hum. Not loud, not constant. But there. Clara turned slowly, scanning the cliffs, the house she could just make out further inland, a crooked silhouette against the sky. The sound faded as quickly as it had come. Atlas's growl deepened, low in his chest. Clara exhaled slowly. "It's just the wind," she murmured. But even as she said it, she felt something tighten in her stomach. The island stood quiet again. Too quiet. And though she had come here determined to treat this as nothing more than paperwork and property lines, the unease that had followed her from the mainland had now taken root. Blackrift Isle did not feel empty. It felt watchful. The island stood still after the hum faded. Clara waited another full minute before moving, listening for any repeat of the metallic vibration. Nothing came. Only the wind slipping through pine needles and the dull crash of distant waves against the cliffs. "Stay close," she said softly. Atlas didn't need the command. He walked slightly ahead of her, but never more than a few steps. His posture remained alert, measured, calculating. Oh, the house revealed itself gradually as they climbed the uneven rise toward the island's center. It was larger than she expected. Weather-beaten but intact, the structure stood on a shallow knoll overlooking the eastern cliffs. The roof sagged slightly at one corner, and gray shingles curled at their edges, but the windows were unbroken. The siding, though faded, had been maintained at some point. Someone had cared about this place. Her grandfather had cared. Clara stopped at the foot of the porch steps. The boards creaked under her weight as she climbed. Atlas paused beside the door, nostrils flaring, then looked back at her briefly before facing forward again. The brass handle was cool beneath her palm. She hesitated only a second before turning it. The door opened without resistance. A faint scent drifted out. Oil, old wood, not something dry and preserved. Not decay, not rot. Inside, the air felt still. The entry room was modest but orderly. A heavy wooden table sat near the window, its surface wiped clean. Tools hung in careful rows along one wall. Wrenches, pliers, measuring instruments, all arranged with deliberate precision. An oil lamp rested at the center of the table, polished to a dull shine. Clara stepped in slowly. Her boots echoed softly across the floorboards. Atlas followed, but his claws made almost no sound. He moved from room to room in short, deliberate passes, sniffing corners, pausing near the stove, circling back toward her. Nothing looked abandoned. Dust lay thin and even across surfaces, but not thick enough to suggest decades of neglect. Shelves held jars labeled in her grandfather's careful script. But coils of rope hung neatly by the back door. A stack of split firewood rested beside the hearth, dry and ready. She walked to the window. The glass was clean. Not spotless, but not fogged with years of salt either. It had been wiped, maintained. "Strange," she murmured. Atlas stopped moving. Clara turned. He stood near the far corner of the main room, body stiff, ears high, eyes locked on a patch of floorboards just beneath the eastern wall. He did not bark. He simply stared. "Atlas!" He didn't move. Clara crossed the room slowly. The boards creaked beneath her weight, the sound magnified in the quiet. She crouched beside him, examining the spot he had fixed on. Nothing obvious, just wood. Slightly darker in tone, perhaps. The grain ran evenly with the rest of the floor. No gaps, no visible seams. He lowered his head and gave a low, steady growl. It wasn't fear, it was alertness. Clara pressed her palm flat against the boards. Cold, colder than the rest of the floor. She held it there longer, waiting for some logical explanation to surface. A draft, perhaps. A hollow beneath. Before she could investigate further, the wind shifted outside, and then it came again. The metallic vibration, this time louder, not a clang, not random, rhythmic, a deep resonant hum that seemed to rise through the floor itself, traveling up through her knees as she crouched. Atlas stepped back abruptly, hackles lifting. The sound lasted only a few seconds before dissolving into silence once more. Clara stood slowly. The house did not rattle. No loose window panes shook. Nothing moved except the faint sway of pine branches outside. He walked toward the back hallway. 2 small rooms extended beyond the main area. A narrow bedroom with a simple cot and folded wool blankets, and a storage room lined with shelves. Everything inside appeared arranged with care. No overturned furniture, no sign of intrusion. If this island was haunted, she thought, it was haunted by discipline, by intention. Night approached faster than she realized. The gray sky deepened to slate, and shadows thickened inside the house. Clara lit the oil lamp on the table. The flame flickered steadily, casting warm light across the wooden walls. Atlas refused to lie down. He paced the perimeter of the main room again, returning always to that same corner near the eastern wall. Each time he paused, listening. Clara checked her watch. She had intended only a brief inspection before heading back, but the engine failure complicated that plan. She would need daylight to examine it properly. The mainland was too far to risk rowing in darkness. Reluctantly, she accepted what that meant. They would stay the night. She secured the front door and drew the thick curtains closed. The house felt smaller after that, sealed off from the vast ocean outside. Atlas settled near the corner he'd been watching, though he remained upright, eyes open. Clara lay down on the cot in the bedroom, but kept the door ajar. The silence pressed in. No distant traffic. No harbor horns. No city hum. Just wind. And beneath it, a faint vibration. It began again sometime past midnight. Stronger this time. Metal against metal. A deep, hollow resonance that pulsed in measured intervals. Clara sat up instantly. Atlas was already on his feet. The lamp flame trembled slightly, though no draft touched it. The sound did not come from outside. It rose from below, beneath the floorboards. Clara stepped into the main room. Atlas moved ahead of her, stopping exactly where he had before. The boards under his paws seemed almost to breathe. Subtle movement, subtle hum. The vibration stopped. Silence swallowed it whole. Clara stood very still. Her heart beat hard against her ribs, but her mind remained sharp. She had spent her career studying structures, bridges, piers, docks. She understood how wind could travel through cavities, how steel could carry sound in unexpected ways. But this felt deliberate, measured. She knelt again and pressed her ear against the wood. Nothing now, only the distant crash of surf. Atlas let out a soft whine, not frightened, but insistent. Clara rose slowly. "This isn't random," she whispered. The house seemed to listen. Outside, the wind shifted again, sliding along the cliffs with a low moan. Inside, the boards lay still. Atlas did not relax, and for the first time since setting foot on Blackrift Isle, Clara felt certain of one thing. The island was not abandoned. Something beneath it was still alive. Clara did not sleep again that night. She remained seated at the table with the oil lamp burning low, boots still on. Atlas stretched near the eastern wall, but never fully resting. Each time the wind shifted, she listened for the metallic vibration to return. It did once more before dawn, faint, controlled, almost purposeful. Then silence again. When gray light finally crept through the curtains, Clara stood stiffly and opened the front door. Cold air rushed in. The island looked unchanged in daylight. The pines swayed gently, gulls circled high above the cliffs, and the ocean lay vast and indifferent beyond the rocks. If she had not heard the hum in the night, she might have believed she imagined it. Atlas stepped past her immediately, nose low to the ground. He did not head toward the shoreline. He angled toward the rear of the house. "Atlas!" He did not pause. Clara followed. Behind the cabin, the land sloped downward toward a collapsed structure half swallowed by brush. It had once been a boat shed, judging by the remaining beams and the rusted tracks that led toward what must have been a launching ramp. Driftwood and moss had claimed most of it. The roof had caved in on one side, and weeds pushed up through broken planks. Atlas moved with sudden focus, and he began pawing at a patch of ground near the base of the shed, digging with force that surprised her. "Easy!" Clara called, stepping closer. But he did not stop. His movements were not frantic. They were deliberate, controlled, the same measured intensity he once showed when locating survivors beneath debris. Clara knelt beside him and brushed away loose soil. The earth here felt different, compacted. Beneath a thin layer of moss and sand, her fingers struck metal. She froze. Atlas stepped back just enough to allow her access, eyes locked on the spot. Clara cleared more debris. A flat surface emerged, dark steel, weathered but intact. A rectangular shape about 3 feet across, its edges concealed under years of drift and dirt. A hatch. Her pulse quickened. She worked carefully, using a broken board as leverage to pry away compacted soil from the perimeter. The outline became clearer, hinged on one side, a recessed handle on the other. The metallic hum she'd heard in the night echoed in her memory. This was no random cavity. This was built. Atlas let out a low sound, almost a breath. Clara tested the handle. It did not budge at first. She brushed away more grit and found a small, rusted lock near the edge. Not decorative. Functional. She wiped it clean with her sleeve. "It's been sealed," she murmured. Atlas stood directly behind her now, body angled toward the hatch, as though waiting. Clara returned to the cabin and retrieved a small toolkit from the wall. Pliers, a wrench, a flathead screwdriver. The familiarity steadied her. Steel and bolts made sense to her. Hidden hums did not. Back at the shed, she worked the lock carefully. Rust flaked away in small red fragments. The metal resisted, then shifted slightly under pressure. She applied more force. The lock gave with a brittle snap. The sound rang louder than expected. Clara sat back on her heels for a moment, breathing slowly. The wind fell still. Atlas's ears pricked sharply. She wrapped her fingers around the recessed handle and pulled. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a slow, grinding protest, the hatch lifted. A rush of colder air rose from below, damp mineral tinged with iron. The opening revealed a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. Concrete steps, reinforced walls. This was not some old root cellar or storage pit. It was engineered. Clara's breath caught. Her grandfather had not been hiding from the world. He had built beneath it. Chassé Atlas moved forward immediately. Without hesitation, he stepped onto the first concrete stair and began descending. "Atlas!" Clara said sharply. He did not look back. He continued down, steady and confident. Clara grabbed the oil lantern she had brought and positioned it over the opening. The flame cast long shadows down the stairwell, revealing metal piping running along the walls, the metallic vibration from the night. She felt it now, not as sound, but as anticipation. Every instinct told her to pause, to retreat, to reconsider. But Atlas had already reached the bottom. She heard his paws shift on solid ground. He barked once, not alarmed, but insistent. Clara tightened her grip on the lantern. Then she began to descend. Each step echoed softly beneath her boots. The air grew cooler as she moved downward, while the light shrinking behind her. The concrete walls were smooth, poured with care. This had required time, planning, resources. At the bottom of the stairwell, the space opened into a chamber larger than she expected. The lantern light flickered across steel beams and mechanical shapes. Gears, cables, curved metal conduits stretching along the ceiling. Atlas stood in the center of the room, looking back at her with steady eyes. He was not afraid. He was waiting. Clara stepped off the final stair. The air hummed faintly, not loud, but alive. She turned slowly, taking in the room. Reinforced walls, heavy bolts anchored into the foundation rock, wind shafts cut upward toward unseen exits, and machinery, complex, deliberate. Her grandfather had built something beneath Blackrift Isle, something meant to endure, But the metallic resonance she'd heard in the night suddenly made sense, not as haunting, but as function. Atlas walked toward a section of the wall lined with sealed crates. He sat beside them, still, refusing to move. Clara felt the tension inside her shift, not toward fear, but toward rising awareness. Whatever this was, it had not been meant for strangers. It had been meant to be found, and Atlas had led her directly to it. Clara stood still in the underground chamber, lantern light trembling against steel and stone. The room stretched farther than she first realized, nearly the length of the cabin above. Reinforced beams crisscrossed the ceiling. Metal rods ran vertically along the walls like ribs, holding the island together from within. Atlas remained seated beside the row of sealed crates, his gaze steady, as the faint hum she'd heard in the night vibrated softly through the air. Not eerie now, but mechanical. Functional. Clara moved slowly around the space, boots echoing against concrete. Her engineering instincts began to override the unease. She traced one of the metal conduits with her hand. It led upward at an angle, disappearing into the ceiling toward the direction of the cliffs. Wind shafts, she realized, designed to capture airflow. Near the far wall stood a large assembly of interlocking gears mounted to a steel frame. Not electrical, purely mechanical. Wind-driven rotation translated downward through vertical shafts into these lower systems. Counterweights hung suspended on chains, perfectly balanced. She lifted the lantern higher. The gears were polished, maintained. Someone had kept this operational for years. While on a heavy workbench lay journals, leather-bound, edges worn but carefully stacked. Beside them, rolled marine charts secured with twine. Metal drafting tools rested in precise alignment, untouched by rust. Her grandfather had not been hiding. He had been working. Atlas let out a soft exhale, drawing her attention back to the crates. There were 4 of them. Wooden, reinforced with steel brackets, each sealed tight. She knelt beside the first and brushed dust from its surface. Stamped across the top in faded black ink. Coastal Survey, North Atlantic. Private. Her pulse quickened. She pried open the metal latch. The lid resisted for a moment before giving way with a hollow crack. Inside were rolled blueprints, carefully layered. Clara lifted one free and unrolled it across the bench. Her breath caught. Well, the diagram depicted Blackrift Isle in precise detail. Topography, underwater contours, tidal flow patterns. Handwritten notes lined the margins in her grandfather's unmistakable script. She moved to the next crate. More documents. Ecological impact assessments. Marine life density reports. Cold water reef mapping. Her eyes scanned the charts more carefully now. She recognized the structure beneath the island's eastern shelf, an intricate reef formation extending into deep Atlantic currents. Rare. Fragile. Protected nowhere else along this section of coastline. The realization settled in slowly. This island was not just rock. It was foundation. She turned to the third crate. Inside lay polished reflective panels, curved steel surfaces angled deliberately. Some bore scuff marks from years of repositioning. Others were pristine. Signal devices. She glanced back at the vertical shafts in the ceiling. Wind traveled through the system above, rotating reflectors mounted within the cliff faces. At certain angles, moonlight or distant harbor lights would strike these panels and scatter across the water. Strange lights along the cliffs. Not ghosts. Geometry. She opened the final crate. Smaller notebooks filled this one. Personal logs. Weather records. Supply inventories. Pages marked with meticulous entries dated back nearly 3 decades. Atlas stood and moved to her side. She flipped through the top journal. Elias Whitmore's handwriting remained steady and sharp. October 12th. Wind patterns holding consistent. Western shaft alignment requires adjustment before winter. Must maintain deterrent effect. Deterrent. Her eyes moved to another entry. On May 3rd, offshore drilling proposal resurfaced. Survey crews returned within 2 nautical miles. Reflective array operational. Acoustic pipes amplified successfully. Acoustic pipes. The metallic vibration. She looked upward toward the steel conduits. Wind-driven resonance. Engineered sound. A low-frequency hum amplified beneath the floorboards, carried through the island's rock. She straightened slowly. He hadn't been building for solitude. He had been building for defense. Clara stepped toward the central gear assembly. The wind above shifted slightly, and the gears responded with a smooth, deliberate rotation. No electricity, no external power source, just air and gravity. She placed her palm lightly against the metal housing. Warm, alive with motion. Atlas circled the room once, then returned to sit directly in front of her, watching her face. The shock did not come as fear. It came as clarity. All her life she had believed her grandfather had chosen isolation out of pride or madness, that he had clung to a barren island while the rest of the family struggled. But this was design, purpose. He had studied currents, charted reef systems, monitored marine health over decades. Her eyes fell on a thick folder labeled Drilling Projection Models. She opened it. Projected seismic impact diagrams overlaid across the reef structure. Red lines slicing through blue contours. Notes indicating collapse points. One contract could have fractured the entire system, destroyed the reef. She exhaled slowly. Upstairs, the island had felt haunted. Down here, it felt protected. Atlas shifted closer, but resting briefly against her leg. "You knew," she whispered. The dog's steady presence felt less like companionship now, and more like confirmation. He had sensed this place from the start. Not danger, but something deliberate beneath the surface. She moved back toward the journals, flipping to the most recent entries. August 4th. If they return with permits, deterrent systems must remain convincing. Fear travels faster than fact. September 17th. I will not see the outcome, but someone will. Clara's throat tightened. The hum of the gears continued softly in the background, steady as breath. She walked the perimeter of the chamber once more, examining the reinforcement points along the walls. This was no temporary shelter. It was an anchor. The island's heartbeat. Atlas stopped near a secondary steel panel embedded in the floor near the eastern wall. He tapped it lightly with one paw. Clara crouched beside him. Another access point. Another system. Her unease had shifted completely. The island was not cursed, it was guarded. And the haunting that kept fishermen away had been engineered with precision. Clara rose slowly, lantern light dancing across maps and metal. Above them, the wind strengthened slightly, and the gears responded with quiet authority. Blackrift Isle had never been abandoned. It had been defended. And her grandfather had done it alone. Clara stood in the underground workshop long after the realization settled. The steady rotation of gears no longer sounded ominous. It sounded disciplined, intentional. Atlas remained close, his posture calmer now, as if the tension that had pulled him toward this place had finally eased. Clara carried several journals upstairs, along with one of the reef maps and a smaller notebook labeled Acoustic Calibrations. She sealed the steel hatch carefully behind her, brushing loose soil back over its surface out of instinct. Not to hide it, just to preserve it. The daylight above seemed different now. The island's wind carried purpose. Inside the cabin, she cleared space on the table and spread the documents beneath the lamplight. The metallic hum faintly echoed through the floorboards again, but it no longer unsettled her. She understood its origin now. She opened the acoustic notebook first. Precise diagrams filled the pages. Steel resonance pipes had been embedded along the cliff face, angled to catch prevailing winds from the northeast. But when gusts passed through, the pipes amplified low-frequency tones that traveled through rock and air. Engineered moans, calculated vibrations, not random noise, but structured sound designed to unsettle anyone anchored offshore. She turned to another page. Reflective array positioning, seasonal adjustments. Detailed instructions described how polished panels hidden along the cliff edge could redirect moonlight or distant harbor lights. At certain angles, they would flash unpredictably across the water. Phantom lights. She pictured fishermen glimpsing those reflections through fog, mistaking geometry for something unnatural. Her grandfather had not relied on superstition. He had constructed it. She moved to the reef documentation. Charts marked with tide patterns, coral density, migratory routes of cold water species. Well, the reef beneath Blackrift Isle extended deeper than she had imagined, anchoring a fragile marine ecosystem that depended on stable current flow. In the margins of one chart, Elias had written, "Seismic testing would fracture shelf. One drilling rig would end this in weeks." Clara leaned back slowly. Offshore drilling. She remembered vague headlines from decades ago, energy companies pushing farther along the Atlantic coast. She had been working long shifts at the harbor then, focused on structural upgrades, not policy battles. Her grandfather had been watching something else entirely. Atlas shifted at her feet. Clara flipped to a journal dated 22 years earlier. March 8th. Developer Consortium returned with updated survey vessels. They underestimate reef depth. Must increase deterrent range. Show April 15th. Acoustic pipes successful in heavy wind. Reports from mainland suggest voices heard at sea. She closed her eyes briefly. Voices. Metal singing in the wind. The stories she'd heard at Barrow's Point were not born from madness. They were the result of mechanical precision. A final journal entry from 5 years ago caught her attention. September 12th. Health declining. Systems stable. If fear persists, reef survives. Clara's throat tightened. He had known he was dying, and he had stayed anyway, not to hide from the world, but to protect something it would not notice until it was gone. She stood and walked to the window. From the cliffside vantage point, she could see the Atlantic stretching outward in muted gray-blue layers. Nothing about the water revealed what lay beneath. The reef was invisible, fragile, vulnerable. The island's haunting had been armor. Behind her, Atlas rose and approached the eastern corner of the room again, placing his paw gently over the same floorboards he had fixated on the night before. The hum beneath intensified slightly as the wind shifted. Clara returned to the journals and found a folded letter tucked between 2 pages. It was not addressed. It was more a statement than correspondence. Fear is a language people understand. Protection is not. If they believe this place cursed, they will stay away. If they see profit, they will come. Her hands trembled slightly. All her life she had believed Elias Whitmore had been selfish, clinging to a barren island while his son struggled financially. But the drilling proposals would have brought money, immediate money. Her father had wanted to sell. Elias had refused. She sank slowly into the wooden chair. The fracture in her family had not been about stubbornness alone. It had been about cost. "What is land worth?" her father had once shouted during that long-ago argument. "More than your own family?" She could hear it clearly now. Her grandfather had chosen the reef, chosen the ecosystem over the immediate survival of his business, over reputation, over comfort. Atlas rested his head gently against her knee. "You let them hate you," she whispered. The hum continued beneath the cabin, steady and purposeful. Clara rose again and moved to the back wall, pressing her palm flat against the wood. The vibration felt almost like breath beneath her skin. The haunting was not malevolent. It was engineered defense. But the island's legend had done exactly what it was meant to do: keep boats away, keep surveys distant, keep development stalled long enough for decades to pass. She returned to the table and gathered the reef maps carefully. If developers had tried before, they might try again. And now the island legally belonged to her. The thought tightened something inside her chest. This was no longer about selling paperwork and walking away. The inheritance was not a burden of property. It was knowledge. Atlas's ears lifted suddenly at a distant sound overhead, faint but distinct, the low chop of rotor blades. Clara stiffened. She stepped outside onto the porch. Far across the horizon, just visible above the waterline, a helicopter moved slowly along the coastline before banking away. Too distant to identify. Too far to confirm intent, but close enough to remind her of something important. The world beyond Blackrift Isle had not forgotten this stretch of ocean. The wind picked up again, rushing along the cliffs. From somewhere within the island's steel channels, the metallic resonance rose. Low, controlled, powerful. Not haunting. Warning. Clara stood at the edge of the porch, Atlas at her side, and listened to the engineered voice of the island speak through wind and metal. Her unease had shifted entirely. What once felt like a curse now revealed itself as strategy. Blackrift Isle had never been haunted. It had been protected by design, and now she understood exactly how. The wind settled into a steady rhythm by late afternoon, and the metallic hum beneath the cabin softened to a low murmur. Clara remained at the table long after the helicopter disappeared from sight. The reef maps spread open before her like a quiet accusation. Atlas lay nearby, finally resting, though one ear remained alert to every shift of sound. Clara picked up one of the older journals she had not yet opened. The leather spine cracked faintly as she turned it over. The date on the first page read nearly 25 years back, just before the shipyard in Portland had collapsed. She turned the page. The handwriting was firm, but the tone was different. January 6th. Daniel met with consortium representative again. He believes the sale inevitable. Daniel, her father. Clara's chest tightened. She had not expected to see his name here. She read on. January 12th. I explained reef structure and long-term consequence. He says I exaggerate risk. Jean says family must come first. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, sharp, impatient, exhausted. You care more about that island than about us. She had believed him. She had been 17, frightened by unpaid bills and whispered arguments. She had watched her mother's hands tremble as foreclosure notices stacked on the kitchen counter. Her father had stood in the doorway of her grandfather's house one evening, shouting words that had carved themselves into her memory. Sell it, Elias. It's just rock and wind. She turned another page. February 3rd. Daniel does not understand that some losses cannot be undone. Once reef fractured, gone for centuries. February 19th. He has agreed to draft preliminary sale agreement without my consent. I will not sign. Clara's fingers trembled slightly. There it was, the fracture point. And her father had tried to sell the island during financial hardship. Elias had refused. The family had split. She closed her eyes briefly, seeing her younger self standing at the edge of the argument, choosing sides without fully understanding the stakes. She turned the page again. March 2nd. Daniel believes I choose stone over blood. He is wrong. I choose future over convenience. The words landed harder than she expected. Future over convenience. She had not once considered that her grandfather's refusal might have been a form of protection beyond the island itself. Atlas stirred as she shifted in her chair. She stood and walked slowly to the window, journal still in hand. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cliffs. The ocean shimmered faintly beyond, deceptively calm. And her father had never spoken of these journals. He had never mentioned reefs or ecological projections. To him, the island had been nothing but stubbornness and lost opportunity. And to her, her grandfather had been a man who abandoned his family's financial survival. She returned to the table and read further. April 10th. Daniel left today. Says he will not return unless I reconsider. I will not. April 14th. Clara did not say goodbye. She stood behind him. I do not blame her. Clara stopped breathing for a moment. Her name. He had written about her. She remembered that day clearly now. The smell of diesel from her father's truck. The way she had stood behind him, refusing to look back at the old man on the porch. She had thought her grandfather cold, unyielding. She had never imagined he might have understood her silence. But another entry caught her eye. May 21st. Isolation easier than regret. The words felt heavier than the rest. She pictured Elias alone on this island, tuning steel pipes, adjusting reflectors, recording wind patterns, while his son's resentment hardened on the mainland. She had built her own resentment quietly over years. Holiday invitations unanswered. Phone calls never returned. Her father had framed the story simply. Your grandfather chose land over family. She had accepted it without question. Now the story felt incomplete. Atlas rose and approached her, pressing gently against her thigh. His presence grounded her against the swell of emotion rising in her chest. "He didn't leave," she said softly. "He stayed. Stayed here. Alone. For decades. To protect something no one else could see." And Clara turned to another section of the journal labeled Correspondence. Folded letters rested inside. She unfolded one carefully. "Daniel, I know you believe this fight is about pride. It is not. The reef beneath Blackrift cannot survive seismic testing. I have run projections myself. If I sign, the damage will be irreversible. I would rather be thought stubborn than live knowing I allowed it. If you ever wish to see the data yourself, come. I will always welcome you. E." Clara lowered the letter slowly. Her father had never mentioned this invitation. Had he read it? Had he ignored it? Or had he never opened it at all? A long, slow breath escaped her. The anger she had carried for decades began to loosen, not vanish, but shift. Her grandfather had sacrificed reputation, perhaps even relationship, to prevent something worse. While she closed the journal carefully, Atlas looked up at her, eyes steady. "I believed the wrong version," she admitted quietly. Outside, the wind moved softly through the pines, and from beneath the island came the faint, controlled hum of steel responding to air. Not haunting, guarding. The story she had grown up with felt thinner now, less certain. Her father had faced immediate financial collapse. Elias had faced long-term ecological destruction. Both had believed they were right, but only one had known the full scale of what was at stake. Clara sat back down slowly. The island had not only been protected from developers, it had been protected from misunderstanding, and she had been part of that misunderstanding for most of her life. Atlas rested his head gently in her lap. Clara stared at the journal for a long moment, at the tension inside her no longer fueled by fear, but by regret. Regret for the years she had judged a man she never truly tried to understand. Regret for the silence she had chosen that final day. The metallic hum beneath the floor rose slightly as the wind shifted again, steady and deliberate. Her grandfather's voice, engineered in steel and wind, still defended this place, and for the first time in decades, Clara felt the certainty she had carried about him begin to fracture. She did not notice the helicopter at first. She was still seated at the table, journals open, when Atlas's head snapped upward. His ears lifted sharply, body stiffening before the sound even reached her. Then it came, the distant thrum of rotor blades, not faint this time, closer. Clara rose quickly and stepped onto the porch, yet the helicopter approached from the south, moving low over the water before circling once above the island. Wind from the rotors pressed the treetops flat as it descended toward a rocky clearing near the western ridge. Atlas moved in front of her, posture tall and protective. The helicopter settled with a blast of grit and salt air. The engine powered down slowly, blades continuing to spin before fading to stillness. A man stepped out. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, dark jacket, tailored enough to signal he did not spend much time outdoors. Sunglasses shielded his eyes despite the overcast sky. He carried a slim leather case tucked beneath one arm. He walked toward the cabin with measured confidence. Atlas growled, low, steady. Clara stepped down from the porch to meet him halfway. "Mrs. Oh, Whitmore," the man called over the lingering wind. "Nolan Pierce." He extended a hand. She did not take it. "I wasn't expecting visitors." "We've been monitoring the estate transfer," he replied smoothly. "You've been difficult to reach." "I was at sea." He smiled faintly. "Yes, so I gathered." Atlas moved closer to Clara's side, positioning himself between her and the stranger. Nolan's gaze flicked briefly to the dog. "Impressive animal," he said lightly. "He works," Clara replied. Nolan nodded and opened his leather case, withdrawing a folder. "I represent Atlantic Horizons Development," he began. "We've been negotiating for access to this coastline for quite some time. Offshore construction permits were recently expanded. Your grandfather, rest his soul, declined previous offers. Well, we'd like to make you a new one." He handed her the folder. Clara glanced down at the figure printed on the first page. It was substantial. more than she had expected. More than enough to settle her remaining mortgage in Portland. Enough to fund retirement comfortably. Enough to erase lingering financial strain she had quietly managed since Daniel's death. Nolan watched her carefully. "This island has no infrastructure," he continued. "No electrical grid. No fresh water system beyond what you construct yourself. Winter conditions alone make habitation unrealistic. We can finalize paperwork immediately." Atlas stepped forward, growling more distinctly now. Nolan's expression tightened slightly. "I assure you, ma'am, we operate within all environmental regulations." Clara held his gaze. His cause. "All environmental regulations don't always account for what they can't see." A flicker of calculation crossed his face. "We've conducted preliminary seabed surveys," he replied. "The reef structures beneath this region are not considered unique." Clara felt her pulse rise. "Not unique?" she said quietly. "Our data indicates acceptable impact margins." "Your data is wrong." Nolan paused. "I beg your pardon?" She held up one of the reef charts she had carried outside instinctively. "This reef extends deeper than your surface scans. Seismic testing would fracture the eastern shelf. Your acceptable margins would collapse the entire formation." Nolan studied her more carefully now. "You've been reviewing private documents? They belong to me." A breeze swept across the cliff edge, and from somewhere within the island, a low metallic resonance rose briefly, carried by the shifting wind. Nolan's eyes flicked toward the sound. "So the stories are true," he murmured. "The singing rock." Atlas's growl deepened. "Legends are useful," Nolan added. "They discourage competition." Clara's jaw tightened. "My grandfather didn't discourage competition. He protected this reef." Nolan closed his folder calmly. "With respect, Mrs. Whitmore, you're standing on aging folklore. Energy demands are increasing. Development is inevitable." "Inevitable," she repeated. "Yes. And you assume I'll sign because I need the money?" His smile did not falter. "I assume you're practical." The word lingered between them. Practical. She had lived by that word most of her life. Measured risk. Structural integrity. Calculated decisions. Atlas stepped closer, and his shoulder brushing her knee, as if grounding her. Nolan adjusted his tone slightly. "You could relocate, secure your future, donate to conservation efforts if that eases your conscience. But this island, isolated, unproductive, doesn't serve anyone." Clara looked past him toward the ocean. The water stretched wide and indifferent, hiding the reef beneath. Unproductive. The word struck something deeper than she expected. "You don't see it," she said quietly. "See what?" "What's under your survey lines?" Nolan sighed, impatience creeping into his posture. "I understand sentiment," he said. "But nostalgia doesn't pay for long-term care or unexpected medical costs. You're 66. Planning ahead matters." Atlas stepped forward another inch. Nolan noticed. He took a small step back. Clara folded the reef chart carefully. "Just, my answer isn't ready." His expression sharpened. "We're prepared to finalize today. Then you'll need to return another day." Silence hung between them. The wind shifted again, and the steel pipes within the cliffs caught it fully this time. A deep, resonant hum rolled across the island, louder than before, steady, controlled, almost deliberate. Nolan glanced toward the ridge again. "For what it's worth," he said coolly, "fear won't protect this place forever." "Neither will greed," Clara replied. He closed his case slowly. "We'll be in contact." He turned and walked back toward the helicopter. Atlas remained fixed in position until the blades began to spin again, until the machine lifted from the clearing and moved back toward the mainland. Only then did he relax slightly. Clara stood still long after the helicopter disappeared from view. The offer lingered in her mind. The number, the security it promised, the ease of signing and walking away. She had come to sell. That had been the plan. But plans built on incomplete understanding had already fractured once in her life. Atlas pressed his head gently against her hip. She rested her hand on his back. "I need time," she murmured. The island answered with another low hum as the wind passed through its steel throat. Not haunting, not threatening, just present and waiting. By late afternoon, the sky began to change. Clara noticed it first in the wind. The steady coastal current that had carried the island's mechanical voice all day shifted abruptly, gusts strengthening, direction veering northeast. The temperature dropped a few degrees in less than an hour. Atlas lifted his head from the porch boards and scanned the horizon. Far out over the Atlantic, a dark wall of cloud advanced low and heavy, swallowing the faint blue that had briefly appeared earlier. The ocean's surface tightened, ripples sharpening into restless peaks. Clara felt it in her bones before she checked her phone's signal. A severe coastal front had formed rapidly offshore. High wind advisory, flash storm conditions. The mainland was 9 nautical miles away, and the skiff's engine still needed repair. She moved quickly. "Inside," she said, and Atlas followed without hesitation. She secured the cabin door and began checking the windows. The wooden frames were solid but old. When she drove additional pegs into the latches with a hammer she found hanging near the workbench. Years of engineering instincts returned automatically. Secure the weak points first. The wind intensified. Outside, pine trees bent sharply, their branches scraping against one another with dry, frantic sounds. The metallic pipes hidden within the cliffs began to respond, low resonance building gradually as air funneled through the shafts. Not haunting. Working. Clara stepped down into the underground workshop. Atlas followed close behind. The gear assembly rotated faster now, driven by the increasing wind. Counterweights rose and fell in controlled rhythm. Steel cables tightened along reinforced anchor points embedded in the island's foundation. She scanned the systems quickly. Shoreline anchor bolts, cliff reinforcement braces. The island was not passive. It was engineered to endure. A sudden crack echoed from above. Atlas barked once. Clara rushed back up the stairs. Outside, rain slammed into the cabin in hard sheets, visibility dropping almost instantly. The sky darkened as if dusk had fallen hours early. Waves crashed violently against the rocks below, sending spray high into the air. Another crack. She stepped onto the porch briefly and saw one of the older pines near the western ridge snap at its trunk, falling across part of the roofline of the collapsed boat shed. The half-buried structure groaned under the impact. Clara's heart pounded. She retreated inside just as a fierce gust slammed against the front door. The entire cabin shuddered. The metallic hum deepened beneath her feet. Not chaotic, but amplified. But wind shafts carried the force downward, distributing pressure through the underground framework. She understood now. Her grandfather had not only built deterrence, he had built stabilization. The gear assembly below controlled tension across anchor points that reinforced the cabin's structural base. Wind was not merely noise, it was energy redirected. Atlas paced near the eastern wall again, but this time not in fear. He seemed to track the storm's movement through vibration, adjusting his position slightly with each gust. The roof creaked overhead. Clara grabbed additional boards from the storage room and reinforced the interior of the weakest window. Her hands moved quickly but steadily. Her shoulders burned from effort, but she did not stop. Another gust struck harder than the rest. The eastern wall trembled. For one suspended moment, she feared the entire structure might lift. Then the gears below engaged more forcefully. She felt it through the floor, counterweights shifting, steel tightening. The vibration steadied. The cabin held. Rain hammered down relentlessly for nearly an hour. Lightning flashed beyond the cliffs, illuminating the room in stark white bursts. Thunder followed seconds later, rolling low and heavy. Atlas remained at her side through it all, eyes alert, body angled protectively. At one point, a loose shutter tore free and struck the side of the cabin with a violent crash. Clara flinched, but did not retreat. She moved methodically, securing, rechecking, adjusting tension bolts she could access from the interior floor panels. Her grandfather's design revealed itself more clearly with every passing minute. He had anticipated storms like this. The island's wind capture system did more than generate sound. It stabilized pressure distribution along the cabin's frame. She descended once more into the workshop mid-storm. The sight took her breath away. The gear assembly rotated with powerful precision, counterweights lifting and lowering in balanced rhythm. The steel braces along the walls vibrated but did not strain. The entire chamber functioned as a hidden spine beneath the island's surface. Atlas stood beside her, unmoving, as if guarding the mechanism itself. "You built this for storms," she whispered. Another thunderclap echoed above, but the island did not fracture. It endured. After what felt like hours, the worst of the wind began to pass. Rain softened to steady sheets, as the violent gusts eased into heavy but manageable currents. Clara climbed back to the cabin's main room. Water had seeped beneath the door in thin streams, but the structure remained intact. Windows held, roof held, walls steady. Outside, debris littered the clearing. Broken branches, scattered leaves, but the house still stood firmly anchored to its foundation. Atlas exhaled deeply and lay down near the hearth. Clara stepped onto the porch cautiously. The ocean still roiled, but the sky showed faint breaks in the cloud cover toward the west. Distant lightning flickered over open water as the storm front moved inland. She looked toward the boat shed. Damaged further, yes, but the steel hatch beneath it remained concealed and intact. She turned back toward the cabin. It had been tested, and it had not failed, but the realization struck her slowly. If Nolan's offshore crews had remained near the island during that storm, they would have witnessed something impossible to ignore. The eerie hum, the engineered resonance, the strange endurance of a structure that refused to collapse. The haunting would have deepened. Fear would have multiplied. But Clara no longer felt fear. She felt something closer to fierce respect. Atlas rose and joined her at the porch edge. Together they watched the storm retreat across the Atlantic, leaving behind a washed and sharpened horizon. The island had faced the Atlantic at full force, and it had held, not by chance, by design. Morning arrived clear and startlingly bright, as if the Atlantic had washed itself clean overnight. The air carried the scent of salt and splintered pine. Yet Clara stepped off the porch carefully, boots sinking slightly into damp soil. The storm had altered the island's surface. Broken branches lay scattered across the clearing. One section of the collapsed boat shed had shifted further inward, exposing beams that had long been buried. Atlas moved ahead of her immediately. He did not wander aimlessly this time. He followed a deliberate path toward the western side of the cabin, where debris had collected beneath the fallen pine. Clara trailed him, scanning the damage. The tree that had snapped during the storm had crushed part of the old shed roof, pushing loose planks and driftwood aside. Beneath the debris, something rectangular protruded, half lodged under a heavy beam. Atlas stopped in front of it. He pawed once, then again. Clara crouched beside him and began clearing the smaller branches away. The object revealed itself slowly, a wooden crate, reinforced with steel brackets like the ones below in the workshop. But this one had been hidden above ground, protected from moisture, intentionally wedged beneath structural beams. She worked carefully, using leverage from a broken plank to shift the fallen timber enough to free the crate. It slid forward with resistance, scraping against gravel. Atlas stepped back, watching closely. The crate bore no external markings except for a small brass plate nailed to the lid. Clara wiped away grime with her sleeve. "To the one who returns." Her breath stalled. She sat back on her heels for a moment, studying the inscription. The words felt less like coincidence and more like certainty. Bounty Atlas lowered himself beside her, tail still, gaze steady. She carried the crate inside the cabin and set it on the main table. The room felt quieter than it had the day before, calmer after the storm's test. The metal brackets were sealed, but not locked. She lifted the lid slowly. Inside lay a single leather-bound folder wrapped in oilcloth. Beneath it, a small brass compass and a folded sheet of paper sealed with wax. Clara lifted the letter first. The wax seal had been pressed with a simple design, an anchor intertwined with a pine branch, her grandfather's symbol. She broke the seal carefully and unfolded the page. The handwriting was familiar, but slightly less steady than the journals she had read. "If you are reading this, then the island has chosen you to stay long enough to see what it truly is." Clara swallowed, as Elias's words continued. "I built the systems below not to frighten the world, but to slow it. Speed is the enemy of understanding. Fear buys time. Time allows truth to surface. Her hands tightened around the paper. You will face pressure. They will tell you this place is wasted potential. They will tell you you are foolish to hold on to it. They may even say I was unwell. A faint, almost sad smile touched her lips. He had known. You carry both engineering and responsibility in your blood. I hoped one day someone who understood structure would understand stewardship. Clara felt the weight of the room shift around her. The inheritance was not random. It was deliberate. The letter continued. I could not repair what fractured between Daniel and me. I accept that. Oh, but I could ensure that what lies beneath this island survives long enough for someone wiser to decide its fate. Her vision blurred slightly. The resentment she had carried for decades now felt misplaced, heavy and unnecessary. I leave this island not as property, but as guardianship. If you choose to walk away, I will not blame you. But if you choose to stay, know that you are not preserving stone. You are preserving life unseen. Clara lowered the letter slowly. Atlas shifted closer, pressing against her knee. She opened the leather folder next. Inside were final engineering schematics, updated tension adjustments, improved anchor placements, refinements to wind capture calibration. Her grandfather had anticipated decades of coastal erosion and compensated accordingly. At the back of the folder was a single handwritten page. It listed her name, Clara Whitmore. Structural integrity assessment strong. Temperament practical. Likely to question first, decide later. She almost laughed despite the tightness in her throat. He had studied her even from a distance. Perhaps through occasional reports from mutual acquaintances. Perhaps through the simple knowledge of bloodlines. Below her name was one final note. If she returns, it will not be for sentiment. It will be for understanding. The words struck deep. Atlas rested his head gently against her thigh. You knew, she whispered. The compass in the crate caught her attention next. It was not decorative. It was a precise marine instrument, balanced and calibrated. When she lifted it, the needle steadied instantly, pointing true north without hesitation. And unlike the fishermen's tales of spinning compasses near the island, her grandfather had understood magnetics well enough to control perception without altering reality. Clara stood and walked to the window. The storm had left the sky crystal clear. Sunlight danced across the water, hiding nothing, yet revealing nothing. She thought of Nolan's offer, the number on the page, the ease of signing. Then she looked back at the letter in her hand. Guardianship. The word felt heavier than ownership. Ownership could be sold. Guardianship could not. Atlas rose and moved toward the eastern wall again, resting calmly now rather than tensely. The metallic hum beneath the floor resumed softly as the wind picked up with the midday tide. The island felt less like an inheritance and more like a test. While her grandfather had not simply left her land, he had left her a choice. Clara folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the oilcloth. She closed the crate and rested her hands on its lid. For the first time since stepping onto Blackrift Isle, her uncertainty began to settle, not into final decision, but into understanding. The island had not summoned her by accident. Atlas looked up at her, amber eyes steady. The storm had proven the systems worked. The journals had revealed the reef's fragility. The letter confirmed intent. Everything pointed in one direction. But choice still remained hers. Clara stepped outside once more, Atlas at her side, and looked out across the Atlantic horizon. The wind moved through the cliffs, carrying the low steel resonance with it. Not eerie, not threatening, alive. Well, she closed her eyes briefly and let the sound settle in her chest. The island had been waiting, not for a buyer, for a keeper. The helicopter returned 2 days later. Clara heard it before she saw it, the distant chop of blades cutting cleanly through the morning air. The sky was clear, the ocean deceptively calm, as though the storm had never happened. Atlas lifted his head from the porch boards and stood immediately, muscles tightening beneath his coat. Clara did not move at first. She had spent the last 48 hours reviewing every document her grandfather left behind. Reef maps spread across the table. Wind calibrations noted and cross-checked. She had even repaired the skiff's engine herself, discovering a loosened fuel line. Not broken, just unsettled. The helicopter circled once and descended toward the same clearing. Now this time, she was ready. Nolan Pierce stepped out again, suit jacket replaced by a heavier coat more suited to the Atlantic wind. He carried a thicker case than before. Atlas positioned himself beside Clara without command. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Nolan called, voice confident but measured. "I assume you've had time to consider?" "I have," she replied. They stood facing one another on the gravel clearing. The island's wind moved steadily between them. Nolan opened his case and withdrew formal documents, thick pages marked with legal stamps and signature lines. "Our revised offer reflects updated permit approvals," he said. "The expansion zone has been finalized. Offshore construction is scheduled to begin early next quarter. If you sign today, we can transfer funds within 72 hours. He extended the document toward her. The number printed on the page was higher than before. Atlas's low growl vibrated softly in the air. Clara glanced down at the paper briefly, then lifted her eyes to Nolan. "You said the reef structures weren't unique. Our environmental consultants have concluded they're wrong." Nolan's jaw tightened slightly. "With respect, Mrs. Whitmore, we operate on data." "So do I." She stepped aside and gestured toward the cabin. "Come inside." He hesitated only a moment before following. Inside, Clara spread her grandfather's reef projections across the table. Overlays of seismic modeling, fracture points, cold water coral density. She had marked recent coastal survey updates beside them, cross-referencing publicly available data with Elias's decades of private observation. "You see this shelf?" she said calmly, pointing to a contour line that dipped sharply beneath the eastern face of the island. "Your preliminary scans miss its depth. Seismic vibration at projected levels would destabilize the entire ridge. It's not gradual erosion. It's collapse." Nolan studied the charts carefully. "Private notes," he said. "Unverified. Verified by engineering logic." She handed him a wind stress model from the underground system. "My grandfather didn't build deterrents for amusement. He built them to buy time." "For what?" "For someone who could read this." Silence filled the cabin. Atlas stood near Clara's side, eyes steady on Nolan's every movement. "You're asking me to believe your grandfather predicted multi-decade offshore expansion?" Nolan said finally. "Yeah, I'm telling you, he saw it coming before anyone else bothered to look closely." Nolan set the documents down. "Even if that were true," he replied, "you can't stop federal permits with old journals." "No," she agreed, "but I can delay them." She walked to the small desk near the window and lifted her phone. Signal bars flickered weakly but held. "I filed emergency preservation paperwork with the Maine Coastal Conservation Authority this morning. Provided full reef documentation. Requested immediate ecological review status." Nolan's expression hardened. "You've initiated a protection hold?" "Yes. That process could take months." "Good." He stepped back slightly, calculating. "Do you understand what that means? Litigation, scrutiny, or pressure?" "I do." "And if the review determines your data is insufficient? Then I'll accept the result." Atlas moved subtly forward, positioning himself more firmly between them. Nolan exhaled slowly. "You're choosing uncertainty over security." "I'm choosing responsibility." The wind outside intensified slightly, slipping through the cliff pipes. A low metallic resonance carried across the cabin, steady and controlled. Nolan glanced toward the sound. "That noise," he said quietly. "You know it scares people." "It's not meant to scare," Clara replied. "It's meant to slow." He studied her for a long moment. "You realize we won't walk away permanently." "I don't expect you to." Silence lingered again. The cabin felt smaller than before, but stronger. Finally, Nolan closed his case. "You're prepared to fight this. I'm prepared to review it properly." He moved toward the door, pausing briefly before stepping outside. "For what it's worth," he said over his shoulder, "most people would have signed." "Most people didn't grow up with a harbor engineer's stubbornness," she answered quietly. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, despite himself. The helicopter blades began turning again. Atlas remained motionless until the aircraft lifted and receded into the horizon. Only then did he relax. Clara stood on the porch, watching the mainland fade into haze once more. Barrows Point would hear about the preservation filing soon enough. Rumors would shift. The haunted island might become something else in conversation. Below her feet, the underground gears rotated gently in response to the afternoon wind. Oh, the choice had been made, not in anger, not in defiance, but in clarity. She had come to sell. She was staying to protect. Atlas lay down beside the porch steps, eyes half closed but alert. The island no longer felt watchful. It felt aligned. And for the first time since stepping onto Blackrift Isle, Clara felt the tension inside her settle into something steadier. Resolve. The months that followed did not move quickly. Winter arrived in long gray stretches of wind and frost. The mainland lawyers sent letters. Conservation officials requested site visits. Marine biologists traveled out in small research vessels, anchoring cautiously beyond the reef's edge. At first, they approached the island the way everyone else had, with hesitation. The pipes sang when the wind shifted. The cliffs shimmered with reflected light at dusk. But once Clara guided them through the underground workshop and showed them the data, the skepticism softened into something closer to awe. The reef beneath Blackrift Isle was mapped carefully over weeks. Divers confirmed what Clara Whitmore had documented decades earlier. Cold water coral structures extended far deeper than public records suggested. Species density was unusually high for this section of the Atlantic. The preservation hold turned into formal review. The formal review turned into protected status. By early spring, Blackrift Isle was designated a provisional marine sanctuary zone. No drilling permits, no seismic testing. The headlines were modest, buried in regional environmental reports rather than national news. But the shift was real. Barrows Point changed slowly, too. The fishermen, who once avoided the island, began anchoring at a respectful distance, not out of fear, but out of understanding. The haunted legend transformed into something quieter, almost proud. They called it the island that sings. Clara stayed. She repaired the cabin roof properly, reinforced the porch beams, cleared debris from the boat shed while leaving the steel hatch undisturbed beneath it. Atlas aged gently through the seasons, his steps slower now, but no less steady. He spent long afternoons lying on the porch boards, watching gulls wheel above the cliffs. Clara restored the mechanical systems not to amplify fear, but to maintain function. She adjusted wind calibrations so the resonance no longer carried as aggressively toward open water. The sound remained, but softened, less ominous, much more like breath passing through hollow bone. The reflectors stayed in place along the cliffs, not as deception, but as deterrence against careless approach. Their angles were precise, designed to catch only the right light at the right hour. Engineered boundaries. The underground workshop remained the island's hidden heart. Clara kept her grandfather's journals on a shelf near the workbench. She added her own entries beside them. Notes on reef temperature shifts, tidal anomalies, small repairs made after winter gales. The work was not glamorous. It was quiet. Steady. On certain evenings when the Atlantic lay smooth and glass-like beneath a pale sky, Clara would sit on the porch steps with Atlas resting at her side. The wind would move through the steel pipes gently, creating a low, sustained hum. Not haunting. Alive. Now she thought often of her grandfather during those moments, not as the stubborn old man her father had described, but as someone who endured misunderstanding for the sake of something fragile. The fracture between father and son could not be undone, but its meaning had changed. Clara no longer saw Clara Whitmore as someone who chose land over family. She saw a man who chose responsibility over approval. And now she understood the weight of that choice. One evening near the end of summer, Clara walked down to the cliff's edge with Atlas beside her. The sunset spread copper and rose across the water, casting long shadows over the island's rock. Far out on the horizon, a distant vessel moved slowly north. The wind shifted. The pipes answered with a soft, controlled resonance. Atlas settled into the grass, chin resting on his paws. Clara looked down at the reef chart she had carried with her out of habit. The lines and contours no longer felt abstract. They felt alive beneath her feet. She had come to this island ready to sell it, ready to close a chapter that had long felt heavy and unfinished. Instead, she had opened one. Ownership would have been simple. Guardianship was not. It required staying when leaving would be easier. It required defending what others could not see. It required standing firm even when misunderstood. Atlas exhaled deeply, content in the quiet. The island no longer felt watchful or tense.
It felt held. Clara closed her eyes briefly and listened to the wind move through steel and pine. The shout was no longer a warning. It was a reminder. Sometimes the people we judge most harshly were protecting things we were never meant to see until we were ready to understand them. She rested her hand on Atlas' back and watched the last light fade over the Atlantic. Blackrift Isle did not belong to her in the way property belonged to a person. It trusted her. And that was enough. As the wind continued to hum through Blackrift Isle, Clara understands that some lyrics aren't meant to be sent. They are meant to be carried. What once looked like stubborn isolation become quiet courage, and what felt like haunting turned out to be protection. If you were standing where she stood, with security in one hand and responsibility in the other, what would you choose? Say your thought below. And if story like this move you, stay with us for the next one.